Today's video is going to be a really weird one because in the end, I think it's going to raise more questions than it does solve answers. The first and probably the most biggest mystery for me personally is why are people still paying 100 USD and sometimes more for an i7-7700 in 2025. Anyway, let's get into the gaming benchmarks where I decided to test the i7-7700 in today's video with the two graphics cards that we used in a recent video. That is the RTX 3060 as well as the RX 5700 XT. And what I decided to do here was test it with the same games against the Ryzen 7 9800X3D because I really wanted to know how much performance you are going to be missing out on with this CPU in some of the latest titles, whether they're the most competitive multiplayer titles like Marvel Rivals, or if you're into something like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which is where we'll start off with the benchmarks here. And this game really is a testament to games that can look really good and be optimized really well, taking advantage of the i7-7700's 4 cores and 8 threads and still giving out decent performance. And in fact, both the numbers on both the graphics cards were looking like they just dropped a little bit because the CPU's just not as powerful as the 9800X3D. It wasn't really a bottlenecking experience, it was just lower performance across the board. Now keep in mind, I did use DDR4 2400 MHz for this comparison because my motherboard that I put it on, a B250 mining Asus motherboard that I got off a really good deal for a huge amount of RTX 4070 Ti's. I'll put the link to this video up here if you want to watch where I got this motherboard from. But essentially I got this motherboard for free, as well as the water cooler that was slapped on top of it. I got that for free off the used market. And the best thing is the i7-7700, I also got that for free as well. And in fact, I got a lot more of these i7-7700s in a recent parts hunt that I did, and I was paying for whole systems with this CPU installed for around 100 Aussie dollars each, which would be around 60 US dollars. That's for a whole system, not just the i7-7700. Though back to 1440p numbers with Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, what we saw here was some actually pretty impressive numbers. It was keeping up with the Ryzen 7 9800X3D. The next title we are going to pull up isn't such a pretty story for this little i7. Let's check this out right after today's video sponsor. Do you need to get Windows 10 or Windows 11 activated and don't want to spend $200 or some other exorbitant price? Well, if so, today's video sponsor VIP SCD Keys has you covered. For as little as $15 using the coupon code BFTYC, you can get Windows 10 activated, and for a little bit more you can get Windows 11 activated too. Links in description below to find out more. Welcome back to Tech Yes City, and here we have Fortnite with a massive tanking in the FPS. Not just in the average FPS, but also with the 0.1% lows. We can see they drop substantially. With the case of the RTX 3060, we are going down from 244 on that 0.1% low all the way down to 40, and then the average FPS drops off nearly half. And then also with the 5700 XT, pretty much an identical story there. FPS on the average nearly halving, and then the 0.1% lows going from 200 all the way down to 27. Now, here's the interesting thing, 1440p. This is the first time I've ever had a exact same result when I'm benchmarking at 1080p and 1440p. The i7-7700 and the 5700 XT managed to do this. And then looking at that i7 with the RTX 3060, this actually fared a little bit better, especially with those 0.1% lows. But then comparing that back against the 9800 X3D, it was still a significant drop in average FPS and 0.1% lows. Just it wasn't as bad as 1080p, which is to be expected. Except one thing I will say is that I could not get resizable bar enabled, even though I could get above 4G decoding enabled in the BIOS. I just couldn't get the resizable bar enabled. And in fact, I tried custom modding a BIOS with this UEFI rebar support method that you can do. The problem is Asus just kept blocking the custom BIOS that I made, and I don't have BIOS flashback, which is one way to get around getting a custom BIOS on an Asus motherboard. If you have the BIOS flashback facility, you can sort of force it to just run that custom BIOS. At least that's how it worked when I was testing things on X99 and X79 to get an M.2 NVMe to boot, for instance. Though at this stage, if you were cheering on for the i7-7700, you may be a little bit down. You may be like, Brian, he's down and out, man. That Fortnite, that was an absolute KO for the i7. And here's where we're going to sort of say, look, it's only 3 knockdowns, right? We get the CPU back off the ground, put him back in the ring with Marvel Rivals, and surely enough, this was actually a really good result here for this i7, scoring nearly identical FPS with the RTX 3060, coming in at 130 versus 127, and the 0.1% lows were 91 versus 86. So actually a really good result for 1080p medium settings. And then going across to the 5700 XT, it did lose a little bit more FPS there on the average, 122 to 109, and the 0.1% lows did go from 93 to 84. But overall, we really lost nothing at all here. And then moving up to 1440p showed a less of a difference between the average FPS. But as I alluded to in the intro, this is where those questions are going to come into the video, and they're going to be digging into your head like they are mine. And you're going to be seeing these 0.1% lows on the i7-7700, where they're actually better than that of the 9800 X3D at 1440p with these two cards. And this was with the 5700 XT as well. And you can just see there a massive boost from 39 to 61. And then also with the 9800 X3D and the 5700 XT going from 35 to then 47 with the old i7. So if I had to hazard a guess what is going on here, I just have absolutely no idea. But the weirdness doesn't just stop there with Marvel Rivals, because in the previous video, we used this game for power consumption testing with these two GPUs with that 9800 X3D. And here's where we get the i7-7700 doing really well. In fact, it was so impressive that I had to take a step back and double check the numbers here, because what we saw with the RTX 3060, for instance, with the i7-7700 is a drop from over 300 watts from the wall down to 258 watts with only 3 average FPS less at 1080p. And then for the RX 5700 XT, it was a similar story. We went from over 400 from the wall down to 350. And again, I'm not undervolting. When we start undervolting the GPUs, it goes down even further, going into the low 200s for the 3060, and then going into the mid 200s with the 5700 XT. So at this stage, if we had to hazard a guess, I actually do think I have some idea of what's going on here, and that is the i7-7700. It's already a very efficient chip to begin with, and those 4 cores, 8 threads, as well as the low amount of actual cache on board, plays well with Marvel Rivals. As we saw with Fortnite, that 3D cache on the 9800 X3D is causing it to give out much better 0.1% lows, but in a game like Marvel Rivals, it's actually looking like it's extremely well optimized. And then further icing on the cake is that perhaps the PCIe Gen 3 versus Gen 4 is working a lot better for the chipset with the i7-7700. So your power savings are just going to come crashing down with something like a mid-range GPU. Though just when things are sounding really good for this i7, here is where it got dealt a huge blow with Call of Duty Warzone. So the COD bros out there are going to be feeling really happy with their Ryzen 7 CPUs. And this is because we got a result here in Call of Duty Warzone. When I was testing this, we went down to effectively on the 5700 XT, a 0.1% low. In fact, this game was just virtually unplayable. I don't know how I managed to get some frags in this mode, because it was just stuttering and it was a really bad experience. But then the RTX 3060, it started out with huge amounts of stuttering, but then it normalized and I didn't get any more stuttering after I initially jumped in. So there's something going on there where the NVIDIA drivers are at least working a lot better with the 7700, at least in Call of Duty Warzone, to give out a relatively smooth experience. Despite the average FPS, again, just like Fortnite, dropping down nearly half. And then in the case of the 5700 XT, again, dropping down practically half. Then we move over to 1440p, and you'll notice here that although the 5700 XT is winning with the i7-7700, you have to keep in mind I am benchmarking just jumping into a multiplayer map, because there's no consistent benchmark tool in Call of Duty Warzone, as well as there's no just area I can jump into. Besides, I think there's a training range, but that's not indicative of real-world performance at all with this game. So I'm just forced to jump into a random area and start benchmarking, and you're going to see a difference in average FPS there. That'll be just put down to variance, especially at 1440p. But you can see there that 0.1% low, as well as that 1% low, is looking absolutely horrible yet again for the i7-7700. But then going up to the 3060, things are looking really weird, where it's actually performing better with the 0.1% lows at 1440p. So at this stage, I'm wondering, is there something to it? Perhaps the DDR4 with low latency. Keep in mind, I did actually tune this CPU in the BIOS to, even though we had a 2400 megahertz limit on that DDR4 memory, I did tune down the timings just a little bit, as well as the command rank of 1T, just to make things a little bit snappier and give it the best experience on a B250 mining motherboard. So what about Counterstrike 2? Here is where the i7-7700 is really struggling with especially the 5700 XT. On the lower settings at 1080p, we're seeing the average FPS go down by virtually threefold. We're going from 623 average FPS to 232, but those 0.1% lows go from 303 down to 72. That is a massive drop in this game. So basically, if you are playing Counter-Strike 2 competitively and you want a smooth experience, you'll definitely want to either get an X3D or a quite powerful CPU that's, I guess, the latest and greatest with as much cache, whether it's level 3, level 2 cache as possible, because I believe this is where the 4-core 8-thread is falling behind. And then moving over to the NVIDIA side of the camp, it actually didn't do too bad, but the average FPS dropped off quite a lot there, going from 418 down to 245. Now moving on to 1440p was a very similar story here, with the FPS dropping off a huge amount for the 5700 XT, but then the RTX 3060 actually did a much better job in terms of those average FPS numbers, keeping it close with the i7 to the 9800 X3D, but then the 0.1% lows did suffer actually quite a bit here, going from 225 down to 80. So the final game we're pulling up for you guys is Starfield, and here's where we saw not much of a difference between the average FPS and the 0.1% lows at 1080p, and then also stepping things up to 1440p. It wasn't a huge difference, but then when we turned FSR 3 on and did the upscaling benchmark, here's where we actually saw a significant difference between the i7-7700 and the 9800 X3D setup. And I believe that has to do with the fact that we don't have a resizable bar available, but it is impressive to see that FSR 3, at least the upscaling portion of it, was still working okay. It's just that the frame generation, even though it said it was on, I don't believe it was working, because I was getting very similar FPS with just the upscaling on as well. Anyhow, with all those numbers out of the way, this is one of the first videos in the history of Tech Yes City where I'm going to be getting quite emotional looking at these numbers, because we just had a complete roller coaster here where we went with some games, we were getting higher 0.1% lows at 1440p, and the i7-7700 with the snappy ring bus wasn't doing bad at all. It was giving out some pretty good numbers. Then other games, it was just getting a complete no contest. It was like the i7 just got DQ'd early in the match, and then the 9800 X3D just kept running away with the ball. And that's what it felt like, especially with Counter-Strike 2, right? But then those power consumption numbers in Marvel Rivals really made me sit back and think, whoa, there is a whole lot more to this power consumption debate than I've previously ever thought. Because it's certainly one thing to pair an RTX 5090 with an i7-7700 and then say, wow, it's performing so much worse than the 9800 X3D, which is obviously to be expected, because this CPU is going to bottleneck a 5080 and a 5090 to oblivion. And then, of course, you're going to get lower power consumption because the GPU is not working hard. But then when we go with a more realistic scenario, like the 5700 XT or the RTX 3060, the numbers then paint a much different story, to the point where you are saving actually quite a sizable amount of power from the wall by going with an i7-7700, and in particular playing a game like Marvel Rivals with very similar average FPS to what a Ryzen 7 9800 X3D would give you. So coming into this video, I thought it'd just be one of those classical, let's take a look at the CPU and see how it performs with these mid-range graphics cards, and everything was just going to be completely in favor of the 9800 X3D. But then coming out of it, it's almost like we've made an episode of the X-Files or something. We should call it the Text Files. TEXAS. Texas.
Hell, Larry, you better get an i7-7700 for $100.
With all shits and giggles aside, I'm probably now going to look into this more and do more research on it, because it's just so curious, especially the power consumption aspect and maxing out those mid-range GPUs. Because let's be honest, if we look at those Steam survey charts, RTX 3060, RTX 4060, they're topping the charts. That's what the most people are using. So collectively, we could save a lot more power if we were undervolting and then getting the right setup to begin with. But lastly, let's talk about the value proposition of the i7-7700. I mean, if you're playing Marvel Rivals and you've got an RTX 3060 and you like saving power, this thing could be an absolute blessing, even at 100 USD. But for me personally, I value this CPU at definitely sub $50 US, because I'd much rather get a 6-core 12-thread i7-8700, especially locally, or go with an X99 budget motherboard from AliExpress and do some kind of Xeon magic there, because this thing, again, it's not overclockable, especially with the cheap motherboards that most people are going to run into. For instance, the Z270 motherboards and even a Z170, I actually don't even think I've seen one of them come through my studio in the last 2 years. If my memory serves me correctly, it's always been H270s or B250s or an H110. So most likely, if you're getting one of these off the used market, and especially you're looking for a budget motherboard, you're going to be pairing it with those cheaper motherboards, and you're not going to be able to extract extra memory speeds, and you're not going to be able to extract the extra clock speeds, especially if you also come into a 7700K. Though at 100 USD, this thing for me personally is a hard pass, especially when we look at the options available, like the i3-10100 even. For instance, locally, there is a 10100 with 4 cores, 8 threads, that's available for $80 asking, and which would be well under 50 USD. And that does the same thing, but also it has a much better upgrade path where the i7-7700 has just reached the end of the line for its platform, and the i3-10100, that's just getting started, where you can go all the way up to the 10-core, 20-thread i9-10900K, which for that CPU, I still use that to this date in my studio. It's actually still an incredibly good CPU. Though other CPUs around this price point, if you want to go with a ring bus CPU, you've got the i5-10400F, or if you want to go with a much newer platform on the Ryzen side of things, you've got the Ryzen 5 8400F, and that can be coupled in with some DDR5 memory. That will have some higher platform costs, especially with the DDR5 versus the DDR4, but also a benefit of going with the Ryzen chip, and this is what I'd personally go for if I was flipping a PC, is I'm finding they're starting to do a lot better in terms of market demand versus the Intel chips, especially with the i5 versus the Ryzen 5. And even then, a lot of people locally here would take a Ryzen 5 over an i7. That's just how the market has shifted over the last couple of years. Anyway, with all that explanation and recommendations out of the way, do let us know in the comment section below what you think of the i7-7700 in 2025. Still a decent CPU. I just think at the eBay market prices of 100 USD, it's quite a bit overpriced. That's just my personal opinion there. And I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button. Also, let us know in the comment section below if there's anything that you want to know about this CPU and today's testing, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And with all that aside, I'll catch you guys in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.